Welcome back to Series Regular, the Hollywood Reporter's all-in podcast on genre television, currently focused on HBO's Watchmen. This week, we're diving deep into Season 1, Episode 3, She Was Killed by Space Junk, written by Damon Lindelof and Lila Bayok, and directed by Stephen Williams. Joining me to break it all down is the great Antonio in the Sky, my weekly Watchmen co-host, Antonio Mazzaro. Antonio, will you be signing autographs after this podcast?
I can't. I've got a brick in my hand.
Got a brick in your hand. Well, just throw it up and we'll see where it lands at the end of this podcast.
Oh, is that how it works? We can find out at the end?
I believe that is how that's how the gag works.
Okay, got it. The brick joke. We're going to do it.
That's the brick joke. We're going to do brick jokes. We're going to do all sorts of jokes and hopefully some smart talks and smart takes here as we are going through week 3 of Watchmen, the most Watchmen-y Watchmen episode yet in some ways, or at the very least, it is the one that features the most overt ties to the graphic novel of any episode yet, as this is the one where the artists formerly known as Silk Spectre and Ozymandias are officially back in play, even if the latter of those two has been in play, just not officially named. Antonio, we are here, week 3 of Watchmen. What did you think?
I was very pleased with a lot of this episode. I'm still thinking about the reveal of Adrian Veidt, and I suspect I will be thinking about that for a long time throughout the course of my life. Very, very thrilling moment, and really great centerpiece for Jean Smart in this episode. Just putting her front and center of the action, putting her front and center of the story, giving her a lot to chew on and a lot of fun right from the jump, shooting a superhero, or should I say a masked vigilante. Clearly, this is not somebody who feels very good about the masked vigilantes that are out there now. Jean Smart's performance is fantastic throughout, incredibly memorable for sure, and a great introduction to this character. And still, Josh Watchmen proving to be one of the craziest shows on TV with everything, as I'm saying, that was going on with Adrian Veidt, with the Lord of the Manor, and Mrs. Crookshanks. So I was very pleased overall.
Yeah, Antonio texted me before we got onto the podcast, and of course, many of you hopefully know that Antonio and we podcast about Mr. Robot over at Post Show Recaps, and I think you said, with apologies to Mr. Robot, the Lord of the Manor stuff is my favorite thing on TV right now.
I did say that, and I stand by it.
Hard agree.
Yeah.
It's just so
it's
good.
It's phenomenal stuff.
It's really, really great.
I have no real idea exactly what's going on there,
No.
and each week it just gets crazier.
It's better and better every single time. If you go to thr.com/Watchmen right now, there's more coverage from this episode, including some interview content with Damon Lindelof, with Jeremy Irons, and Jean Smart about the arrival of Laurie Blake into the HBO Watchmen universe and the reveal of who it is that Jeremy Irons is playing, even if we've known all along, or at least have strongly suspected, that the Lord of the Manor and Adrian Veidt are the same person. It's nice to just have the air cleared, and I feel like I wonder how this lands with people who don't have the comic book history to draw upon, people who are just tuning into HBO's Watchmen as their first exposure to this story. I think that the way that they're talking about Adrian Veidt elsewhere in the episode would help make that reveal land with some authority. But for you and I, Antonio, I think, and people like us who were suspecting at the very least that this character was the exact same character as Adrian Veidt from the comic book, did it feel like it was a major reveal for you, or was it more just like a delightful confirmation?
It was both, really. I mean, can it be both? Like, is there a way for them to have both stuck the landing on it being a reveal and also just feeling like a delightful confirmation? Because that's how I felt. Like, I felt like it's not a secret when they begin the scene on a bust of Alexander the Great and he's wearing the Ozymandias mask,
right?
That it's Adrian Veidt, that it's Ozymandias, and yet it is still a great moment when the camera centers Jeremy Irons there and he just says, Adrian Veidt. Like, how can you not say that that's both a great reveal and just something that you feel great to have confirmed? I still think that there could be some argument for there being some kind of chicanery going on here. I really don't think that's the case. I think this puts it mostly to bed, but it's just odd. When is this happening? Where is it happening? Why is it happening? All of those questions being in play do make you wonder, like, exactly what am I watching, even though I'm sure now that the Lord of the Manor is Adrian Veidt in this way.
Right. It's Argentina, right? Isn't that what Petey's friend on the Argentina desk said, that Adrian Veidt isn't dead? He got plastic surgery. He's hiding somewhere in Argentina.
That's the rumor. Don't cry for me, Ozymandias. The truth is, I never left you. I've been at the manor the whole time. It's possible. I guess it's possible he's in Argentina. It's possible that this isn't occurring over a period of years, even though it seems like it is, even though it seems like we're now in the third year of these scenes. So wherever he is, it seems like he's been there a while, and he's trying to get out. And his attempts to get out really are quite macabre. Really, it's just tough to watch.
Yeah, poor Mr. Phillips, whichever one this is.
Yeah.
Whether this is Montrose or some other new Mr. Phillips, it's a pretty rough break for the guy.
Speaking of break, yeah, it's frozen right to the core and broken off. This is brutal.
Yeah.
I would think that he was shot into space, but then by what and why with a rope around his body? I mean, and then you see the models in the workroom there, and there's like he's modeling what looks like a spacesuit, but it's very rustic, and he's modeling what looks like some kind of giant catapult. Like, I really don't know what the hell is going on. You can't catapult someone into space, can you?
I don't think so. I don't think that's how it works, but Ozymandias also helped create a gigantic telepathic squid that annihilated millions of people, so don't put it past him to make a miniature catapult that can launch people into outer orbit.
Well, and we know from PDpedia, the supplemental materials that HBO is providing with each episode, we know that his the layer that he had in Antarctica, the name of that is escaping me, but Karnak the Magnificent, we know that layer is gone. It's empty. So I would think, okay, maybe this is a Karnak type situation, right? Where he's in this lush-seeming estate, but really just outside of the bubble is Antarctica. But it does not, I mean, it really seems like he's trying to shoot somebody into space. He looks like he's building some kind of spacesuit. So I really don't know what he's doing.
It would make sense if he is sending somebody out into like the cold abyss of Antarctica too.
Yes.
The frozen state of poor Mr. Phillips when he's coming back.
But we're also burying the lead that there's a game warden, apparently, wherever he is, wearing a mask and sitting on a horse and shooting him as he attempts to claim a kill that will give him a thicker hide for a suit. So he is in prison, it seems like. And that's what it seems like from the context of the notes that are being sent back and forth. He's in some kind of captivity somewhere. It's bonkers. It's just bonkers stuff. And I don't know how it will tie back into the main story of Watchmen in Tulsa. But I think you're right. I think we started to get a little bit of a hint of that this week. And I think that's certainly something we should talk about as we get to that point of the episode.
Well, I think since we're here, we may as well just stick with the Lord of the Manor since it's like its own show anyway. So let's just get into the Lord of the Manor stuff, and then we'll talk through everything else from the episode. But there's a lot of great Easter eggs within the Lord of the Manor sequence, even before it's officially revealed that he's Adrian Veidt. Like, he has this miniature terrarium, right, that looks like it could have been Karnak, which is, again, if you haven't read the comic books, we talk about the comic books here clearly on the podcast. He has this base in the middle of Antarctica called Karnak. That's this lush, tropical, super civilized, wonderful place that he goes and retreats to. And he has this little terrarium here in the Lord of the Manor sequence that you can see as the camera is crawling across the room. That was very evocative of that. You see some of his music choices, Antonio, which seem maybe a little whimsical and arbitrary and kind of fueling that, funky, weird vibe that's going on in the Lord of the Manor scenes in the Adrian Veidt storyline. But it's not chosen for no reason. Like, as per the comics, Adrian Veidt is into reggae. He loves dub music. This is something he reveals during an interview in one of the ancillary materials provided by the graphic novel. It's just like the fun little attention to detail things like that make this show such a delight for people who know the material, the original text, the way that clearly Damon Lindelof and his team of writers have paid such fidelity to.
Definitely. And it's not just the little music choices or those notes that are great treats. It's just seeing, like, it's the idea that whatever he's up to, it's so crazy that in that scene where you're talking about the camera panning around the room, he's tanning some kind of hide. And I was for a moment wondering, are those the skin of the clones that he was burning? Like, is that the skin of the clones he was burning in the play in the earlier episode? And I'm not convinced that it wasn't. It looks like there's some kind of animal being tanned or skinned on the outside there. So I think it's an animal hide, and clearly he wants to get a thicker animal hide later. But the possibility that I would even wonder that tells me that just about anything can happen wherever the heck he is. So it's a wild world for sure, from terrariums to music choices to whatever he's doing, tanning and making a suit. And it looks like he's like old forge work, like he's cutting the top off of the glass with just heat. This is crazy stuff. And I'm given to wonder, like, knowing what we know about Ozymandias. So his parents immigrate. They die when he's about 18 years old, right? And rather than inherit their money, he rejects it and says, I'm going to build myself up from the ground up. And then he does that. And that's proof of his success. I am wondering, like, did he put himself in this situation? Is this the sort of thing that a really bored old Ozymandias would do, is give himself an unsolvable puzzle, a Gordian knot, if you will, that he had to try to find his way out of, considering he's done everything else he possibly could. What would an aging Ozymandias do if he's bored and he feels like the only thing he can't do is achieve what Dr. Manhattan has, immortality and true godlike status? How would he keep himself occupied? This does seem like the kind of task he would set himself with. And so that's the thing that I'm wondering about is he in a position of his own choosing? And is he like trying to puzzle his way out of the situation? So that's sort of what I'm looking around for when I see these things on the side and little ideas that he's having to try to build things. Did he put himself in this position, and is this him trying to work his way out?
Yeah, how Adrian got his groove back.
Right. He listened to Desmond Dekker, Israelites, obviously.
Yeah, which has earwormed severely into my brain right now, and I'm not complaining about it.
Yeah, you could go far, far, far worse.
Yeah.
That is a great thing to have earwormed into your brain. And so, great choice by Adrian Veidt. I want that record player. It's everything about it is cool as hell. And it's hilarious because you're right, it does tie directly into the comic source material. He was just like the proto-hipster. Like, you probably haven't heard of this, but you'll like it, I'm sure, if you listen to it. It's really
that's
funny.
what he tells the interviewer when he's talking about dub music. It's very, very funny. I love whatever it is he's doing with this Mr. Phillips, suiting him up in armor and saying, "This will be the one. I feel it in my bones." And then he sends him out into whatever mission that very clearly does not work. We push in with the camera. The camera pushes in on poor Mr. Phillips's face, and there's like the drum roll in the background, and then we see he's just frozen dead, and Veidt is just like smashing his boot into his body. He kicks his arm off and is just repeatedly like cursing, and
the cursing is so funny.
It's truly, it's like razzle frazzle brazzle,
Yes.
It's just like gobbledygook.
But it's also horrifying. He's like abusing a corpse.
Yes. Well, if you haven't read it yet, I strongly encourage over at thr.com/Watchmen. I have an interview up with Tom Misen, who plays Mr. Phillips, the various Phillipses. And he goes into great detail about how costuming was very helpful for him working on this show because it helped him track what kind of a Phillips was he. Was he a Phillips who is like deeply familiar with the master, works closely with his master? Is he a Phillips that works in the kitchen and barely gets to see his master? Maybe he's laying eyes upon Adrian Veidt for the first time in a scene that he shows up in. And so we see the way that he shows up here talking to Veidt, and like not even like flinching, like not even batting an eye when Adrian Veidt is just nuking this poor guy, this poor corpse on the ground.
Who is him?
And it's him. And it says so much about the state of being for these people that Veidt is surrounded by. He also talks about in the interview about how he and Jeremy Irons and Sarah Vickers, who plays all the Crookshankses, had, before anything even started, they sat around at a table and conversed about what the storyline was going to be, because all of these scenes, the Lord of the Manor scenes, shot in Wales, produced before the main production of Watchmen began in Atlanta, written and produced before that. And they had a conversation about what is life? What is the meaning of life? Are these people, or whatever Phillips and Crookshanks are they really alive? And if they are, what can Adrian Veidt do to them and get away with and feel morally clean? If they are not alive, what can he do to them and walk away feeling morally clean? And so I think that the ethics of the way that Adrian Veidt treats these clones or whatever they are is going to be very front and center in this storyline. And if that's going to take a turn, it sure as shooting hasn't turned yet.
Definitely not. Definitely not. And I don't know what could. It's not clear that these, at first when maybe we thought in episode 1 that they were robots of some sort, and he was let down by the fact that there was a confusion between a horseshoe and a knife, and that they would not be able to think or learn what he wanted them to learn. I thought maybe these are robots and he's failed to develop them. Like maybe this is a reminder of his failure. But now it doesn't seem like that. Now it just seems like they're infinite. They're clones. It's not clear if he's even making them. How long did they emerge? We don't know exactly like where they're coming from. But it doesn't seem as much to me now like Veidt has agency over them. He's just using them, and I guess he feels bad about them to a point, but clearly not bad enough about them to not use them as crash test dummies and send them into space and freeze them. So they must be totally expendable, and I don't think he's attached to them in any way. Or maybe we're just going to need a thicker skin if we're dealing with this, because it seems to be that Phillips is getting killed on the reg here in Watchmen. At least one per episode almost now. We're into this. Maybe not the first episode, but now we are. But we're also just what's going on with Veidt overall. Like I said, he's in a position where I watch him and I see him maybe be disappointed, and I wonder, is he disappointed in his creation? He seems a little bit sad. When he puts on the full Ozymandias costume and he looks at himself in the mirror, it comes off as sad to me. Did it come off that way to you as well?
Yes, yeah, and I think that was intentional. In the interview that I do with Damon Lindelof, talking about how it doesn't fit the same way, right? Like he's an older man. This is an older Ozymandias than the one from the comics. We're 30 some odd years on from the man who dropped a squid in the middle of New York and changed the course of humanity forever. So for it to feel like he is a little bit off his game, I think is by design. Lindelof talks about how it was very interesting to him as somebody who loves the character of Adrian Veidt. Without hesitation, Lindelof told me that Veidt was his favorite character from the comic by far and away. Not even a question, and always was. That what he was really interested in with getting a chance to tell a story about this character was to take him out of his element almost. You know, Watchmen, the graphic novel, is a story about how, at least in Ozymandias' mind, everything is so neatly in his control. He's got the situation handled, to the point that when Rorschach and Night Owl, both of whom are name-checked, even if Night Owl isn't outright name-checked in this episode, when they arrive at Karnak to confront Ozymandias at the end of the graphic novel, like, what are you doing? What are you planning? And Ozymandias mustache twirls his way through a monologue. He tells them at the end, like, the only reason I'm revealing this monologue to you is because you've no chance of stopping me. It's already happened. It happened more than a half hour ago, 35 minutes ago. Right. That's how in control he is throughout the entire graphic novel. And there's one issue left. And it's only in his final scene that he expresses any lingering element of doubt. And it's very private and only to Dr. Manhattan. So for the sake of the show, we are seeing an Ozymandias who, in many ways, is in control of his faculties still. He shoots a buffalo in the eye with, like, razor precision with a bow and arrow. The things that he is doing, rather impressive. Whether or not that suit worked, it's a very impressive feat.
It's a martial feat of Comanche horsemanship.
Yeah, for sure. A hell of an engineering job. That however many years on, this is still an Ozymandias who does have it, but he's clearly in a situation where, whether it's by his own design, as you speculate, which I think is an interesting speculation, certainly based on the letter from the game warden, when he says, the game warden writes to him and says, "I beg your pardon, sir, but when you first arrived here, we agreed upon the terms of your captivity." Is it that Ozymandias is captured? Is it that he's captured himself? We obviously have no idea yet, but if it's something that is by his own design, it sure looks like he doesn't want to be part of the design anymore. And so this gives us a very different version of the comic book character. Somebody who's still fairly consistent with a lot of the things that we know about him. He's very clever, very smart, seems to have a level of disregard or apathy towards living creatures, only insofar as they cater to his whims and his needs. But somebody who is not the master of the situation. He may be the lord of the manor, but that's just a title. deal. And I think that that's fascinating. I think that it's giving us some very bizarre stuff and very delightful stuff to behold.
That was in the letter the game warden writes. He says, "Your humble servant, the game warden," which, I mean, those words could mean a lot of things, but they could literally mean he's working for Adrian Veidt in some way. Adrian Veidt does not address the game warden in the same way. "Your humble servant, Adrian Veidt." He says, "All best wishes and encourage, Adrian Veidt." Yes, so great.
He's pleased he enjoyed the tomatoes as well.
Pleased he enjoyed the tomatoes. It's an interesting relationship. There's a Jolly Roger flag. It does seem like some sort of comic book goings on. And the game warden is wearing an eye mask, like we see other places in the episode. There is that level of what does Adrian Veidt say? He says, "I'm not a Republic serial villain.
Right.
I'm not a dastardly forest brigand." Yeah,
and he says, I'm not a Republic serial villain in the comic book as well, referencing the Republic serials, and just a great callback to something he once said to Dan Drieberg and Walter Kovacs before he informed them the full scope of his plan. So yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say exactly what's going on with him, but I think just the clarification, the confirmation that this is indeed Adrian Veidt that we are watching here, and it's a different shade of Adrian Veidt than the man that you know from the comic book is really fun. And if you're not coming to this from the comic book, what is a big deal, to clarify what it is you're watching here, is that this is a man who is chiefly responsible for the state of the world as it is known in the context of the Watchmen TV series. The Squid Rain, all thanks to this guy, you assume. At least it's birthed from the initial plan that he had. So this is a very important figure in the world of Watchmen, and the world of Watchmen believes him to be dead. And I think that the narrative is a little split on Adrian Veidt. It would seem like there's probably a lot of people who still hold him in high esteem, that he was a prolific businessman and popular figure in the context of the graphic novel in the 1980s. But there are people who are not fans of Ozymandias, as Laurie Blake herself, played by Jean Smart, very sharply points out. So it's a big deal that this is who this guy is.
Right.
And it leaves us, I don't know, it leaves me very, very hungry for A, tomatoes, and B, more Adrian Veidt.
Well, and there's a possibility we don't really know everything that happened, obviously, in the time period from the Squid incident in the 80s until now. But we know that it is not known, I don't think at least widely, that Adrian Veidt was responsible for that Squid incident. He didn't take credit for it publicly. In fact, it was important that he not take credit for it, because humanity had to feel they were under threat from an outside force in order to band together and stop being afraid of each other. And so that was his whole plan. And yet there are some people within the context of the show we're watching who believe that he was responsible.
The truth, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Who are, but they're not the good people in the show, right? It's the 7th Cavalry. It's the people who have found a way to see their own images in Rorschach's face and come up with their own agenda that they read into Rorschach's existence. And Rorschach himself had discovered that Adrian Veidt was responsible, like we've talked about. And so these people are the ones who believe that he was responsible. So there's a lot of talk about him out there in the world. I mean, like you said, even when Jean Smart and Agent Petey are flying into Tulsa and they see the Millennium Clock, which is, we don't know what the Millennium Clock is. It's been visible in a couple of shots so far, but we haven't really got an idea of why it exists.
Right.
But we find out it was built by the lady who bought Adrian Veidt's company. And she quoted Adrian Veidt, or she quoted Ozymandias, the poem, when she dedicated the clock. So he's a figure that is present in the minds of everybody, including people randomly building towers in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So this is not a guy who would have been obscure in the world. His disappearance makes the front page of the paper in Tulsa, as we see in the first episode. His presence, therefore, as a living being, at least in some way, we don't know exactly what timeline on this show, is significant. Like I said, I'm fascinated to see how it will tie back into Tulsa, if at all. If at all. It may not. I mean, it may be a separate story that's being told, but I have a feeling there will be some some way that it ties back into the event.
It's going to for sure. No chance that it doesn't. Whether it's just metaphorically or thematically, but I think that more so even than, the Watchmen graphic novel tells a comic book story within the context of the comic book, and that's much more metaphorical. That's much more thematic. This is dealing with a very important character from the mythos, so hard to imagine that it doesn't come colliding into the main narrative at some point. And the folks involved in that storyline have said as much, just a matter of how that collision occurs. That's the TBD. Unless you've got anything else on the Lord of the Manor, we should start talking about Laurie Blake.
No, I think it ties directly back in because Laurie Blake is another character, as you observed at the beginning of this discussion here, that is a major presence from the graphic novel, a major character in the graphic novel who, unlike Sister Night or unlike Looking Glass, is somebody that was a vigilante or was a masked hero within the context of the graphic novel. And we're now seeing what she's like in our current timeline, and it's vastly different. So she, of course, is aware of Adrian Veidt, but she also has opinions on superheroes as a whole. It doesn't seem like it's going well for the masked vigilantes in Laurie's world. Not at all.
Not at all. Well, she seems like she's part of this anti-vigilante task force on the FBI. But yeah, she used to be the Silk Spectre, which was a legacy hero. Her mother was the original Silk Spectre in the world of Watchmen. Laurie herself was an active crime fighter for quite a while, as made mention in the show, in this episode. She used to date Dr. Manhattan. We now know a whole lot about Dr. Manhattan just from the context of the show, and his memory keeps getting evoked here. Talk about things that are inevitable in terms of its collision to the show. More and more, I'm convinced that Dr. Manhattan is going to have huge importance to the end game of Watchmen season 1 here. But Laurie was dating him once upon a time. In the comic book, that relationship comes to an end. She starts to embark on a new romance with Night Owl, Dan Drieberg, who is a fellow masked vigilante, and the two of them end the graphic novel not quite in witness protection, but basically with new identities, new looks, and it seems like they are going to go off and continue their adventures. And what we get from the PDpedia, which is the HBO.com ancillary material on Watchmen that Antonio referenced earlier, and now we know who PD is, which is nice, based on this.
Hopefully we'll meet Pedia soon.
And hopefully we will. In some of the material that's been listed there, it would seem as though Night Owl and Laurie Blake, who was not Laurie Blake in the comic, but her father is Edward Blake, the comedian who is a very central figure to the comic book, and she makes that discovery over the course of that story, that Laurie took on her father's last name, took on her father's moniker, called herself the Comedienne, and the Comedienne and Night Owl were active for 10 years post-Watchmen, post the comic book. The ancillary material makes mention of their apprehension at some point in the mid-90s. Night Owl, based on the information we get in this episode, appears to be still imprisoned to some capacity, whereas Laurie is obviously free, but maybe not so happy. She's actively seeking out vigilantes, taking them down. She shoots Mr. Shadow, Antonio, and shoots him without any regard for the possibility that maybe he's not wearing body armor. And it seems like she's got a pretty dark, bleak outlook on vigilantism. She's going to say to Angela at one point, "What's the difference between a masked vigilante and a masked cop?" And Angela says, "I don't know." And Laurie says, "Me neither." She really seems to have a fairly nihilistic view of the world, which is kind of honoring the tradition of her father, who, Antonio, was not a great guy.
Not a great guy. I would say not just nihilistic, almost aggressively nihilistic. That joke that you talk about that she tells to Angela, she tells fully knowing that Angela is Sister Night. I mean, she saw her profile in the FBI room when there was the case briefing before she came to Tulsa, and it says right on Angela's profile, a.k.a. Sister Night. She knows she's a cop. She knows she's a masked vigilante, a.k.a. a cop with a mask on. So she is being aggressive to her in that moment, in saying that. She is being hostile to her in that moment. And that kind of goes back and forth throughout the course of this episode. Her hostility to Angela Abar, having never met Angela before, seemingly only because Angela is wearing a mask as a police officer. Laurie is hostile to Senator Keene about this too, because of course what happens is she starts, the episode starts, she starts telling her joke, which we can get into, but she talks to Senator Keene. He comes in and he says, like, "I heard you caught Mr. Shadow. Thanks for keeping our streets safe," and all that. that, and he's got an agenda. He wants her to come to Tulsa. He basically says, I'm not sure it's the 7th Cavalry. It could be a vigilante that's doing this. And he's got his political life is on the line, basically, because he's the one who, it sounds like, created DOPA, the Defense of Police Act, or whatever it was that allowed the police to wear masks.
Right.
He said crime is down 80%. All these other cities want to cover it, but someone's trying to start a war, and he's worried, as Laurie fills in, that he won't get to be president if they do, because it'll undermine his political legacy. This seems important to me. This seems like maybe this is a larger story that we're going to explore in this episode, or in the series, that maybe Judd was killed in some ways to undermine the police force, to start some sort of incident which will prevent Senator Keene from becoming president. Like, maybe there is some political story here. Laurie doesn't seem interested in all of that, but Senator Keene says, like, I can get your owl out of the cage. And that seems to be really a reference to Dan Drieberg being in jail, as much as it is a reference to the fact that she has a pet owl in her apartment. So she's not in a happy place.
Who?
Yeah, the owl. The owl guy, the guy that's in the cage.
Who is on first?
No, who's in the cage?
Who is in the cage?
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And it was really great to see that. It was really great to see all the owl imagery. Clearly, she is still carrying a torch for Dan, who appears to be behind bars in some capacity. We've already discussed in the podcast that a lot of Dan Drieberg, the Night Owl's technology, is apparent on the show. The goggles that we once again see Angela Abar rocking in this episode, the goggles, they do something. So that's nice. But why he's imprisoned and she is not, that's harder for me to put together. Maybe it's just a matter of a stance, or a matter of, if he is in jail, Laurie will cooperate, maybe to keep him safe. Who knows? I think that's a larger story to tell for sure.
Is it possible that she, quote unquote, sold out and was willing to join up as an official FBI agent, and he wasn't willing to join as an FBI agent to crack down on vigilantes?
She has a history with working with the government when she was with
So does her father.
Right. When she was with Dr. Manhattan, the two of them were working with the government. And as you say, Antonio, the comedian was employed by the government. He was one of the only vigilantes that was still allowed to operate. So it may have been like a legacy thing that she was able to get back into, or something that maybe she would have been more comfortable with than Dan. I loved that pop art behind her in her apartment. Cool. Her apartment is filled with great little callbacks as well, but that pop art that features herself, it features Ozymandias, it features Night Owl, and it features Dr. Manhattan. And if you go back and if you look at it, you'll notice, certainly I think it's pretty obvious that the Silk Spectre illustration looks like it's Gene Smart. The Ozymandias illustration absolutely looks like Jeremy Irons. It's a little blurrier, so it's a little harder to make out. Night Owl wears a mask, so it's a little hard to see if he looks like anybody. I was trying to look at the Dr. Manhattan pop art image and trying to see, like, does that look like a familiar actor? Because there's no casting that has been announced for Dr. Manhattan on the show. And I don't know if you were studying that at all, Antonio.
Yeah, all I saw was David Cross as Tobias Funke.
That would be
That's all I got.
That would be tough. That would be difficult. I'm hoping. I know that Damon Lindelof says he doesn't, with the exception of Regina King, does not tend to work with the same actors across multiple projects. But my fingers are crossed for Justin Theroux as Dr. Manhattan.
I know you just want to see. I know. Yes. I know why.
Yes.
Why.
We don't need to. We don't
his
need
unique biometrics.
His unique biometrics, I think, would make him quite the Dr.
well
Manhattan.
Suited for Dr. Man.
Well suited.
Yes. Speaking of carrying a torch for the Night Owl, she's carrying a torch for Dr. Manhattan, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we should talk about that. The episode it's got this framing device of the joke that she is telling in, like, the Dr. Manhattan phone booth. Do we have an official name for this contraption that she is standing in?
No, I noticed that it was from the True company, which we found out Lady True is the one who bought Adrian Veidt's company and who built this Millennium Clock.
Right.
So the name is running consistently throughout here. I don't have a Mission to Mars kind of phone. I don't know exactly what that is, but it seems to be a service where theoretically you could send a message to Mars and send a message to Dr. Manhattan, and he's listening. I guess Dr. Manhattan wouldn't need a phone. Being Dr. Manhattan, he would just kind of know what was going on, but maybe this provides people with the comfort of knowing that they can put a call to someone or somewhere and it would connect directly to Mars. And Laurie seems to get some kind of respite from it. She's a platinum user, it sounds like, of the service. So this is something she gets something out of. She's telling a joke. She's talking about a male bricklayer who's very precise, and every brick has its place. And he's got a daughter, and all a man has is his legacy. So he's going to teach his daughter how to be a bricklayer, and he's going to build this beautiful barbecue. And then he gets all these plans together. And then there's one brick left over when they're done. And his daughter doesn't know what to do with the brick, so she picks it up and throws it as high as she can. Oh, wait, that's the messed up joke. So that's the beginning of this joke, is a brick joke. Were you familiar with the brick joke motif before we got into this episode, or is it something that had been kind of swimming around? It's a trope, right?
No, not at all. Was not on my radar at all, and then you mentioned it to me, and I wonder if this will illuminate people as well, so please get into it.
Yeah, it's a thing. Like I had kind of heard this before and not understood it.
I know, like the Shaggy Dog story. I feel like
it's a lot like that.
It's in the same vein. I don't think it's quite the same. This is literally like you throw a brick up at the start of your joke, and then you feel like you screwed it up, and you ignore the brick, and you tell a second separate joke, and then the joke ends with the brick landing and causing some kind of impact.
Correct. Yeah, this is a thing that is out there, and it's just something that it's like a thing that, like you said, like the Shaggy Dog story, where it's something that's been done in jokes, and the fact that she does it and pulls it off so well is really cool. Like, it's a very fun device, like you said, that frames the episode, but it is also like this thing where, I mean, how do you tell a joke to Dr. Manhattan? Honestly, like, she talks about how he doesn't have a sense of humor, but what would Dr. Manhattan laugh at? What joke would he not see coming? How could you use comic timing to make Dr. Manhattan laugh? And the answer is you really couldn't. So maybe you have to surprise him in some way. And the joke itself is about surprising a supreme omniscient being. And maybe he wouldn't like that punchline because it ends with God getting his brains blown out through his nose by a falling brick. And maybe Dr. Manhattan wouldn't like that. But it is not lost on me that the device itself is the sort of thing that you might have to use in order to tell a joke to Dr. Manhattan. But it seems like this is something she does commonly. She says she calls and tells him jokes a lot.
Yeah. I think that she still feels very connected to him, and the fact that we know, at the very least, we've questioned whether or not Dr. Manhattan is actually in the situation that people publicly believe him to be. But if Laurie, at the very least, Laurie doesn't know any differently than what the public story seems to be. She says, you've been on another planet for 30 years. These people think you still give a shit about us, but you've been living on another planet for 30 years, she tells him. And we're not really worth giving a shit about anyway, are we? That was a big crux of the Dr. Manhattan story, is how over time, with his kind of omniscient abilities, and he sees time and space very differently than the normal human being, which is part of his aspect of the joke. The three stories she tells of the three men, obviously, at least to us, maybe not obviously to everybody, are about Night Owl, or about Ozymandias, and about Dr. Manhattan specifically. And the Dr. Manhattan story ends in terms of him getting banished and sentenced to hell, with him seeing it coming because he's already there. And that's the way that he views time. And that's the way he talks about time and space. And that only gets worse over the course of the graphic novel, that he is starting to lose sight of individual humanity. And it's only when he sees like an emotional moment from Laurie, when she puts together who her father is in the comic book, that he starts to once again realize the potential in humanity. But that's the last time it seems like Laurie ever saw Dr. Manhattan. And at the point that we're at in the story, it doesn't seem like Laurie has seen Dan, the Night Owl, in a very long time either. She seems very, very lonely. And the only potential person, the only potential confidant she has to contact is this frickin' phone booth for Dr. Manhattan. What's more, and I don't think that this should be glossed over, Laurie is one of very few people on the planet that knows for sure the truth about why the state of the world is the state of the world in the universe of Watchmen. She is there as part of the resolution of the graphic novel and coming to realize what happened. She's there firsthand. She's in the streets of New York City in the aftermath of the squid arriving. She sees the dead bodies on the streets. They were all just trying to get tandoori chicken, and instead they were all slaughtered. And she goes to Karnak with Dr. Manhattan, and she's part of that confrontation with Ozymandias. It's why she says to Petey, I too am not a fan. But she knows that keeping the secret is the only way to preserve whatever peace has been forged by Adrian Veidt's terrible plan. And she's had to live with this. I think probably you can imagine that at the very least when she was with Night Owl, she had somebody to share that burden with. Now she's got nobody to share that burden with. I think it makes a lot of sense why she would have a pretty pessimistic view of the state of the world as a result of that.
No doubt, no doubt. And it's I think, a very smart device, very smartly written, how the joke as a structure throughout shows her opinions about the three people that she's talking about. And in the Adrian Veidt section, she does talk about drop the giant squid, alien squid on New York. Everyone was so afraid of it. They stopped being afraid of each other. And she basically says you can't make a tomlet without breaking Greg's.
I had that in my notes as well. Same page.
Yeah, she can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, is what Adrian Veidt would say, and that seems to be what he's doing, by the way. He's breaking Mr. Phillips's, so he's trying to make some kind of omelet. But this is something that she's carrying around with her, and it definitely colors her opinion of a lot of things, as you're saying. So it certainly would be coloring her opinion just of superheroes in general. Overall, it just seems like she's stuck in the past in a lot of ways. You talked about the owl imagery. We also pretty much have to talk about the briefcase that she's carrying with her, that she has at her apartment where she's playing Devo, that has the code 667 on it. And then we don't know what's in the briefcase until late in the episode. We find out what's in the briefcase.
Take a look inside.
Yeah, it's my doc in a box.
Yes.
Is this what you expected to be in that briefcase? It's a jaw dropper for sure.
There is a lot of attention to detail when it comes to Lower Manhattan on Watchmen through 3 episodes so far. Yeah, that was a lot, and apparently not going to do the trick on the night that this episode ends on, where she is going to go and pay Petey a visit, which I thought was great because what we learned about Petey in this episode, who is a character that I really, really liked. I mean, coming into this episode, having read the ancillary material really helps give you even more sense of character for this guy. The Peteypedia is really worth checking out if you're really into Watchmen. If you're into Watchmen enough that you're listening to this podcast, you should absolutely be checking out Peteypedia. And some of the material that you're seeing there are like these internal FBI memos written by Petey, and they're written in such a way like that you can tell that he's probably not the most well-liked person in the office, that he's talking about things that nobody else really wants to talk about. Nobody else seems to really be paying him much mind. You get that sense from him in this episode as well. He had a PhD in history. He wrote his thesis about masked vigilantism, specifically these riots in 1977 that Laurie was a part of, that she was working to combat.
Yeah, the police strike.
Right, exactly. Right. Back in the day. And he says, and I got yanked away from my track to come, work the projector for the FBI. And so he has sort of this like matter-of-fact attitude about him. He says like, don't talk to me like I'm some sort of fan, but he does feel like he's a guy that has like some sense of nostalgia or wonder, or at least deep interest in the world of masks, and maybe isn't quite starstruck by Laurie Blake, but feels some level of kinship or envy potentially towards her. And him bringing the Lone Ranger mask, as she calls it, like, don't wear that thing. You're FBI. You're not one of these people. She really like takes him down for trying to wear that on his way into Tulsa. And what you end up with when she's in bed with Petey by the end of the episode, you see, you don't see them in the act. You see them afterwards, and he's asleep in bed, and he's got the Lone Ranger mask on. And in the comic book, there's a sex scene between Laurie and Dan Drieberg, and there's a couple, and the one that is the two that are more helpful in terms of them actually enjoying themselves both involve costumes. And I thought that was a really interesting touch, that even though to the world she seems to exhibit this real skepticism and loathing towards the act of masked vigilantism and even masked law enforcement, in her private moments she still has some sort of calling back to that world, whether it's through the doc in a box and calling Dr. Manhattan on the the intergalactic phone booth, or as simple a detail as Petey wearing the Lone Ranger mask while they're in bed together.
Yeah, and they're staying at the Black Freighter Inn,
right.
Which is like terrifying if they had read that comic book. So it's there are these moments, you're right, that are Easter eggs or that are shout outs to the graphic novel, but they also are instructive, as you're talking about. It is instructive that Petey puts a page from Rorschach's journal in the presentation from the FBI there at the briefing before they go to Tulsa, because it says something about how he views these issues and what he's thinking about. We see Rorschach's journal, right? He's reading these things in his room, like he's into it. He's all in, and it's not necessarily on a fan level, but it also kind of is because of the mask moment, like you're talking about. So it's really just clever stuff that's being done here in an instructive way. And like I said, just the way she tells the joke and what she says about the judgment of the three characters. Like, for example, the fact that Dan was so smart and he was able to invent all this technology, but he didn't kill anyone. And God frowns and says, "You're too soft." That's her view of the joke. Like, that's the way she's telling the joke. She tells the joke about everything that happened with Adrian Veidt and everything that happened with Dr. Manhattan. So it's instructive about what she thinks about people as well. So are her direct interactions, obviously. I like the indirect stuff, but the direct stuff is so delicious in this episode. Her interaction with Looking Glass is just phenomenal. It's so funny, and it's so like eviscerating. And for Looking Glass, I think you've remarked, is sort of the Rorschach of this series, in that he puts that mask on and you see yourself in it. He's
like
that
wiping
idea.
Imaginary sweat off of his masked face with the yellow rag. Like, dude, if you're perspiring on the outside of that thing, what's it like underneath there?
Right. But he is just completely eviscerated. He keeps up a little bit, but really she is in control. In his interrogation room, she undermines him and says, "It's a racist detector." So funny. So funny. He says it determines and exposes negative cultural biases to which the suspect might not otherwise admit. And she says, "It's a racist detector." And then, later on when he says,
it's an oversimplification.
Can I have the? It's an oversimplification. Can I have the control back? And she's like, "You mean the racist detector?" Like she won't let it go, and he is not in control in that room. So it's interesting that he asked for the remote control back, but it's a role reversal for him in that room. She is asking him, for example, the same kind of questions that he was asking Sister Knight, asking Angela in the car. But she's asking about Judd here and says, why was there a tox screen done? She wants to know about the cause of death. She wants to know about these sorts of things. It's not immediately clear why that's so important and why she later in the episode says, "We were going to dig him up anyway." But she feels like something's being swept under the rug here, and she's immediately on the ground investigating. She notices, for example, wheelchair tracks under the tree. So she comes into this place where these masked vigilante cops are just acting like horrible people. If there were any other group other than white supremacists that they were rounding up with these dogs and these forced DNA swabs, we would feel horrible about the scene that we saw. It feels fine in some ways because it's white supremacists, but it's
still chilling. It's chilling.
Yes.
It's still chilling to see, even with that.
Yeah, definitely. And those in the ACLU and those people who believe in human rights, no matter what, would say it doesn't matter how odious their views are. They have the rights to civil rights. It doesn't seem like Laurie feels that way, because Laurie asks one of the guys that Pirate Jenny and Red Scare are bringing in, like, "Have they violated your civil rights?" And he says, "Yes." She's like, "Yeah, I don't care, actually." And I think that's it just shows who she really is. She doesn't care about what's going on. Angela doesn't really seem to be participating in this, but Laurie seems to have no problem with it.
Yeah, Antonio, didn't you know Angela's not a cop anymore?
I had heard that, and yet here we are. Yeah, it is a
dangerous line of work.
It's a dangerous line of work.
Great to see Regina King and Jean Smart in these roles opposite each other, where you've got these incredible powerhouse actors from so many great stories across television and film, colliding together. One of whom is already iconic from the graphic novel, is the character she's playing. One of whom is becoming iconic here as Sister Knight, and clearly, I think that hopefully in the balance of things, these are people who are going to have aligned interests, but at least right now it's fairly contentious between these two, and it just creates so many delicious moments of calamity, like when Laurie finally confronts Angela after everything that goes down at the funeral with the explosion, and the suicide bomber is taken out from the 7th Cavalry, and she goes and she like, how about that coffee now? And she confronts her and basically says, you don't strike me as the fainting type, suggesting that Angela took something from Judd's closet. And when she goes through all the reasons why, and Angela just responds by like feigning fainting. It was so good. I'm so happy we've got Laurie Blake on the show, because I think that with Judd being gone, she presents sort of like this different weight that needed to be there, a very different kind of authority figure that is now walking around pounding the pavement here in Tulsa, one who's familiar to us if you're a Watchmen fan from the get-go. But I think even if you're not, this episode that's an introductory episode into her really just draws you into her story in such a vivid way.
Definitely. And it is just, it's great because there is some loyalty, obviously, in the department to Sister Night, because it is LG who is so difficult about it. He doesn't want to admit that she is Sister Night. When Laurie asks, he hesitates and says, yes, he's like real ashamed about admitting that she is, because I think he's just been grilled, right, by Laurie, and he knows what's coming. So when you do see Laurie and Angela really facing off in this episode, it is so great. It is. Laurie is just so brusque. Like, she introduces herself and she says, "Oh, and you must be Cal." Like, she's just right there and ready to talk to them, and just in everybody's faces. And of course, she's keeping her weapon. And of course, she's the one causing problems. And of course, it is Angela who springs into action to save everybody. But at the end, it just seems like these two could easily be oppositional forces, and yet it could also be that these two could work together. And I'm excited by that possibility as much as I am excited seeing Regina King pouring coffee down the hole and feigning being scared. Like, it's just so great. But there's also the opportunity for these two to work together and really kick ass, and I'm loving that. It does seem like something bigger is afoot with whatever is going on with Senator Keene. It is he who is targeted by the 7th Cavalry at this funeral. It is he who claims, after all, it was the heroes that saved me that we should focus on. It's him that is right in the center of this and ready to talk to the media. And I just am given to wonder, considering the entire graphic novel universe of Watchmen is so founded on false flags, and so founded on people staging events to get their own goals out of them. Is Senator Keene somehow involved in what's going on? Did he know the 7th Cavalry were coming? He just seems like he's a little too comfortable with being ready to respond to all of this.
The Watch-Manchurian candidate.
That's perfect. I love it. Maybe you should pass the time by playing a little solitaire. It is. There's something going on here for sure. And I don't know if Laurie will recognize it or Angela will recognize it, or they will recognize it together. Laurie seems to be interested, or at least she's okay with carrying water for Senator Keene. I'm not sure we've seen that out of Angela. Angela tells Senator Keene, "I'm not a cop anymore." So I at least on that level, she doesn't trust him. I don't know what that says about if there is something to investigate here, if they're both going to be willing to admit it, if they're both going to be willing to tell truth to power, if only Regina King is, if only Laurie is, but I'm fascinated to see where it goes.
My question for you is, so poor Judd is dead, but also now poor Judd is exploded into into unrecognizable mush.
The last roundup is about to happen.
Yes. As the 7K terrorist comes out with the bomb vest and everything, and he says, if it's wired to my heartbeat, and if I die, this bomb goes off. Shout out to Lost season 4 finale. Very similar thing going on there. And he gets shot, and he wasn't bluffing. The bomb is gonna go off, and they have to act fast. And Angela puts him into the grave, and then plops poor Judd's coffin on top of it. There was so much made, Antonio, about the fact that Judd's body was going to be exhumed the next day. Laurie wanted to know why there wasn't a toxicology on the body. We keep hearing, we heard it in episode 2, we heard it again here. There is no doubt about it. This man was hanged to death, and that is how he died. All signs point to that. But we've also heard now that things are moving very quickly, that Judd's funeral happened very, very, very fast. What kind of chicanery are you sensing here? Because certainly some form of shenanigans are afoot here, and I don't mean the place with the mozzarella sticks and the goofy shit on the walls.
You're talking about shenanigans. shenanigans, right? Yeah, it was very convenient that Judd's body was exploded like that. Very, very, very convenient. I'm not saying it was convenient to the point that Angela did that on purpose.
Right. But I mean, like, convenient that if the body is gone, then like something that could have been revealed by a toxicology report the next day probably could have turned this 9-episode first season into like a 5-episode first season.
Right.
Like we probably could have yada to whatever the final reveals will be.
Right, because looking back, what we remember is that Judd hit the stop sticks with his car, or the car that he wasn't driving, he was a passenger in it. He got out of the car with the stop sticks, and then he was flashed with some light, and that's the last thing we really remember. And then he's hung in a tree, and there's a man in a wheelchair next to him there. So how does that all happen? What blanks are we filling in? We don't know yet. Was he drugged? Does him being drugged play a role into the fact that he was hanged? It is not clear in any way. We still also, Josh, in the first episode, talked about the fact that it did seem like it would probably have been an inside job because they were waiting for him when he left to go greet the police officer who awoke in the hospital, which, by the way, we don't even know if that guy ever did wake up or not. It's seemingly that's the case. There was a page, he talked to somebody, but he left at that time, and that's when the stop sticks went off. So where does the chicanery start? Who does it involve? Does it involve Judd being drugged in some way? That is certainly what is afoot here. And the levels to which it goes, I think, will have to be sussed out by Sister Knight and certainly by Laurie. I do wonder if, to some extent, if LG was in on it. LG was the one asking Angela, was he drinking? Right. Did he use any other substances? So he was asking those same sorts of questions along those same lines to Angela in episode 2. So at least it seems like it was on his radar as something to ask about. So was he involved? I don't know. Somebody was involved, though. It certainly seems from this episode that we're not just assuming it was straight up 7th Cavalry.
What else from this episode stood out to you before we start wrapping up?
Just some quick hits, really, generally speaking. The Russians are building an intrinsic field generator.
Right.
That's something that was mentioned at the press conference with Senator Keene. That sets off some Dr. Manhattan vibes for sure.
Yes, that is how Dr. Manhattan was created. John Osterman getting trapped inside the intrinsic field generator, which was also name-dropped during The Watchmaker's Son, the play from last week. Is a Russian Dr. Manhattan going to show up by the end of this first season?
Well, listen, Russia being involved with our politicians or being involved in our affairs of state is certainly something that is timely and topical.
And it's got roots in Watchmen in terms of the Russian and American tensions at the core of the original Watchmen. And is that something I know that, you know, in speaking about how the comic book was so timely for its era, that was something that Damon Lindelof wanted to capture here in the writing of a new modern retelling of some of the same thematic ideas that are at play in Watchmen, and that white supremacy is the big existential threat in America of 2019. And not to say that it's not, it absolutely is. But the Russian thing didn't go away. And that's not something that has been talked about as like an upfront thematic in the HBO adaptation.
Right. We haven't been to a Burgers and Borscht.
Right, not yet. And so now to have that brought up as just a throwaway here, I caught that as well. That was very interesting to me. Please, God, let Red Scare find himself caught in an intrinsic field generator so that Red Scare could become the Russian Dr. Manhattan by the end of Professor Moscow.
Some lower Leningrad.
Yes, exactly.
And wait for that tracksuit to pop off, baby. That is really. I still think he's an Okie. Like, I really don't think he is Russian.
No,
I think he's an Okie.
That's a great idea.
Accent.
I love it.
Washington Monument has a ring around the top. Just one of those weird details. John Grisham is going to retire from the Supreme Court. That's probably good. The title of the episode, She Was Killed by Space Junk. No one in this episode that we know of was killed by space junk. What do you think the tie-in here? Obviously, we hear about the brick and the joke, and the end of the episode is literally a car falling from the sky, presumably the car that the old man was in, Louis Gossett Jr., at the end of episode 2.
So Angela's car, right?
Angela's car, yeah, but not her Sister Night car, just her throwaway car, Civvy car. But what about She Was Killed by Space Junk? Who was killed?
Well, it's a Devo reference for one, and she was rocking out to Devo at the start of the episode. As you mentioned, it certainly connects to the brick joke as well, and it's literally falling from space, so it's space junk to some degree. And there's the twinkle in the sky. Is it Dr. Manhattan looking out for Laurie? Feels like that would probably be a little too cute. I don't know if you're suspecting Dr. Manhattan's direct involvement in the return of the vehicle, but what I would connect Dr. Manhattan to in this case, and with a very evocative title like She Was Killed by Space Junk, if we're talking about Laurie Blake getting killed by space junk, well, she's alive by the end of the episode, but the way that Dr. Manhattan sits and lives and exists within time, and he is such a central focus in this episode, is that things have already happened. 30 minutes from now, Dr. Manhattan is currently experiencing it, right? Like, he has that relationship with time where all things are happening at once. Is there any way to map that on to Laurie Blake's fate, such as the arrival of this vehicle, this space junk, as it were, by the end of this episode is putting Laurie on some kind of path that she's not going to be able to walk away from? Is she killed by this space junk arriving in her life 30 days from now, a week from now, 3 days from now, whatever point in the future this first season of Watchmen wraps?
It's a good question. And
I think that would be a very intense thing for Damon Lindelof, who has such high esteem for the Watchmen graphic novel, for him to kill off a prime character from the Watchmen graphic novel, to me feels like that's probably a line that he's not going to cross. But it's not impossible.
It's not impossible. It's not impossible. And honestly, it's a question of what's the right fate. She's clearly caught up in a lot of what's gone on. I don't think she wants to die. She's also very rash, though. She shoots people without real question, and she has to apologize, of course, for shooting the 7th K guy, who the bomb was really wired to his heart. But she doesn't seem to be behaving in the most responsible of ways. I mean, she goes out and immediately sleeps with Agent Petey, who theoretically, I guess, is her... I mean, it's her colleague, but is he her inferior in terms of is she his superior in the department? Those sorts of questions. It's she does not seem to be behaving the most, the most in order of
by the book,
protecting herself, looking out for herself. She seems to be a little bit dangerous. Of course, we have to keep in mind she was a masked vigilante, so she probably has that streak in her. It does seem to still be present here. Would I call it a death wish? No, but it's not something I would. If she did die, I wouldn't say she didn't have coming. That's what I'm getting at. Is it? I can at least see it approaching her, or I can see her behaving in a type of way that would invite it. Whether it would happen, whether Damon Lindelof would do that, is definitely a different question. And so far, I would say no. But you're right that. Other than her, there isn't anyone killed by space junk in the immediate moments of this episode. Even within the joke, God is described as a man by Laurie here, so the God is not a she. So maybe there was a Mrs. Crookshanks under Mr. Phillips there, and the frozen Mr. Phillips that fell out of the sky. Maybe she was killed by space junk. I don't know, but yeah, that's the title of the episode. So something else is going on. Speaking of something else going on, Laurie channels Stannis Baratheon a little bit because Senator Keene said the chief got hung, and she corrects him and says hanged,
yeah,
which I loved. Fewer people were there, for sure. Some of the supplemental materials this week were interesting. I want to give a shout out to Samuel Salamoni, who tweeted at me at SJ Salamoni on Twitter. Samuel pointed out that there are 2 different documents in this week's Peteypedia. There are 3 different documents total, but 2 have a connection. One is is sort of a 4-page obituary of Judd, and in that obituary, it talks about his wife and her birth name, Jane Lesley Crawford nee Alexander. So Alexander was her birth name. In another, which is a legal document, which I got to say, just from a recreational standpoint, I didn't love reading, even though it was important stuff, and I recommend anybody read that because it's about the Tulsa Massacre and the legal grounds for reviewing the case with a full panel of judges so that everybody's opinion can be sought on these matters, whether or not people actually have legal standing to bring action all these years later on that incident. Samuel pointed out, though, that there was a dissent, that there was another case that someone was suing the state of Oklahoma, perhaps to prevent this, and that person's name was Alexander. So it seems like maybe Mrs. Crawford's family may have been involved in that reparations case somehow. I don't know if we're going to tie those things together, but I thought that was a good catch by Samuel. That's the sort of stuff that is in the supplemental material. It also says in Judd's obituary that he was one of 3 survivors of the White Night. We know 2 for sure. Is Cal the 3rd?
Yeah, that could be. That would make sense. I mean, he certainly survived it. And are they only counting police officers?
It's a good question.
If that's the case, then you would count Judd's wife as well, right? It seems like she was probably home during the incident.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I don't know who
there may
the
be a
third one
police
was.
officer who is yet to be identified on the show. They also mentioned during the FBI meeting in this episode that most people resigned, right? Those who didn't die. So it's possible that if there was another police officer who survived the White Night, maybe they're just not part of the story anymore. But it's a very specific number, and it does make you think, who is the other one, Antonio?
Oh no, that's a good question. You almost triggered me. In that same FBI meeting, we see Judd and Angela's files on the screen. In Judd's, I noticed that he is listed as 190 pounds. Do you think I could lift 200 pounds? It seems to make sense.
Where's the extra 10 pounds? Lots changed since the White Night.
He'd been laying it on. He'd been banging those rails of coke, so maybe he should have been skinnier. Who knows? But everyone, both Judd and Angela's social security numbers are listed there, and they have 10 numbers, not 9. Now, I don't know if that's a production thing to not list someone's real social security number, or if something in the world of Watchmen is so different that they have 10 numbers. We also saw, I think, the best image yet of the full new flag of the United States of America. I did not count the total number of stars on it. We know it's probably 51 at least.
At least.
I don't think any states are gone, although it's possible that some are. But it looked like it was more than 50 to me, and we know Vietnam is a state. So whether or not it's 50, 55, who knows? But we got a really great look at that flag. Also in Angela's file, it says owner of Milk and Hanoi Bakery, parentheses, still yet to open.
Yeah, that's going to be the final scene of the season, obviously.
Bakery opening up.
Bakery's opening up, the grand opening. Sister Knight retired. Angela is finally ready to get those mooncakes to the people of Tulsa.
I also really like the character note when Laurie is using Looking Glass's face to pick her teeth. She says, well, if you make your face shiny, people are going to use it. And she calls him by his name, Wade. Everybody else seems to call him LG or Looking Glass or Glass. She calls him Wade. So she is really just proceeding to undermine his whole aura, his whole thing that he is as Looking Glass. She does a great job of undermining all of that in that scene. And those little notes about her looking at herself or calling him by his name, making him peel that mask up just about higher than we've seen it. I think really, really good. So I really appreciated those little details of Laurie's behavior. What did you think about the car falling out of the sky at the end? We talked about how it's probably Angela's car from the previous episode. Why then? Is there any reason why it would have fallen out then versus any other time?
Well, I think that is when you start to get suspicious of who from the original storyline may be involved here, like who, or at least who like really deeply connected to the original storyline may be involved here. The arrival of Laurie in Tulsa and then this car dropping in her lap and her looking up at the winking Mars. Is there some connection to Dr. Manhattan, or at least somebody who is deeply aware of Laurie's connection to Dr. Manhattan and wants to draw her in deeper to whatever it is that's going on? Maybe because Laurie knows more about Ozymandias and what Ozymandias did to the world. Does that make her a severe person of interest? I think either way, it's not. I gotta imagine that it's going to make that relationship that's already so fascinating between Laurie and Angela all the more fascinating when Laurie explains to Angela how her car has been returned to her.
Definitely. And it is like the synergy of her finishing the story about the brick falling on God is there. Like I said, I also really like the idea that the girl would have to get one over on God, that she was standing behind all the heroes and that God was focusing on all these big bad heroes at the pearly gates, and there was this girl standing behind him the whole time. If you assume that Laurie is the girl in the story and that she's the one who threw the brick, she's the one who got one over on God, and God himself went to hell in her version of this tale. So just the connection there to that. Then when she is right out of that scene, a car almost falls on her and doesn't, and she probably feels immortal for a moment. Like, that could have fallen on me and died. It didn't. I feel very alive. Maybe I feel protected by Dr. Manhattan. Either way, like, she feels a certain type of way when it falls, and you're right, something made it fall. So what is it? Who knows? What about, Josh? Should we wrap this up by talking about one great shout out as she ends her joke to the graphic novel? Roll on snare drum, curtains, good joke.
I love it. It's great. I mean, it's such a smartly written show for a lot of reasons. But, there's a contingent of people out there who love the Watchmen graphic novel, who are not thrilled about this show, or who are not giving this show a chance. And indeed, Damon Lindelof even encouraging people who are extreme Alan Moore loyalists to not watch the show, because Alan Moore does not want you to do it. So if that's where you're coming from, he really wants you to stand by the courage of your convictions. As you know, Antonio, from the many years that you and I have known each other, I lack courage and convictions. So I am deeply watching this show. But for those of us who are engaging with it, it is just that level of fidelity to the source material that is one of the many rich layers that's making this so much fun to chew on every week.
Definitely. I mean, you in your interview with Damon Lindelof and the discussions that have been had about this season, the discussion is that they were reading the graphic novel chapter by chapter as a writer's room. They were loving it. So the book club is relevant. It's there. There are these great little touches. And so I definitely appreciate it. We didn't have as much of the story within the story with American Hero Story this week. We saw a reference to it on top of the cab that Laurie takes in D.C. But we also did get a deeper one of the supplemental materials. Agent Petey, of course, ever the one to write memos, wrote a memo about vigilantes in pop culture and wrote about American Hero Story Minutemen. And he complained, Josh, about his access to screeners. So
I know the complaint, Petey. I understand it.
Yes, he feels you deeply on some intrinsic field for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we are wrapping here on She Was Killed by Space Junk. Next week, Antonio, episode 4 of HBO's Watchmen is called If You Don't Like My Story, Write Your Own.
Seems aggressive.
Yeah, it seems on point to a certain section of the fandom for sure. So we will get into that next week. Make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to Series Regular, however you listen to your podcasts on your app. You can find us, leave your ratings and reviews. Greatly, greatly appreciated. Any feedback you want to send our way, seriesregular@thr.com. I'm on Twitter @RoundHoward. Antonio's @AC Mazzaro. We will be back next week with another episode of the Watchmen podcast here on Series Regular. If you haven't gotten your fill of all things Watchmen, check out thr.com/Watchmen for much more. Antonio, anything else?
No, that's it, man. I had a great time talking this week, and I can't wait to find out what Adrian Veidt gets into next week.
I know. Oh,
might be another planet altogether. Like, this guy is trying to go into outer space. He's burning people. He's freezing people. What other elements he's going to blow somebody away in the wind?
Oh, fantastic. All right, well, we'll find out soon. Until next time, roll on snare drum, curtains, good joke.